actually, I am from Missouri. I grew up there and always kind of had an interest in the history of the state. But it wasn't until later when I was in undergraduate school and graduate school that I became really interested in the antebellum history of Missouri, particularly the history of slavery in the state. I had this sense that maybe slavery was a little bit different in Missouri than it was in the Deep South. Certainly different than most of the books that I read about slavery in the South, because I certainly wasn't seeing a lot of large plantations as I was driving through the countryside, and so I had a sense that it was, that maybe it was different. It wasn't certainly as widespread, and perhaps on a smaller scale than in other parts of the South. And so I began to explore that and found that indeed that was true, that slavery did differ in Missouri in a lot of ways, and it mostly had to do with the geographic location and again with the size of slaveholdings, which was mostly small in a place like Missouri. Things did differ there. Certainly the interactions between enslaved people and slaveholders on these farms were intimate, and by that I don't mean in a necessarily positive way. It was, but they did live and work together intimately with one another each day. Sometimes slaves even lived in the same home as the owners. And so you can imagine how difficult that would be to live in that kind of an atmosphere. And so ultimately, the relations between people were very human. They did have a fairly good understanding of one another. I would argue that enslaved people had a better understanding of their owners than probably their owners did of them. But they did know enough about one another to sometimes help one another, but oftentimes learn how to manipulate one another because they didn't know each other so well. And as far as family and community lives, I think that the thing that is probably most unique about the book is talking about the lives of enslaved people on these small slaveholding units and how that affected their family and community lives. I found that in Missouri, the vast majority of couples were in what were called abroad marriages, which means that the husband and the father oftentimes lived on another slaveholding, sometimes next door, sometimes a couple miles away, sometimes 5-10 miles away, and they were only allowed to see one another usually once a week, sometimes twice, and so that had very dramatic effects on slave families in a place like Missouri. There was no slave quarter community like you would find on large plantations in the South. And so, all of the different aspects of the community that historians have written so eloquently about, religious life and mutual support for one another, and the transmission of culture that occurred in the slave quarter community. Those things happened in Missouri, but it was more difficult because there weren't, in most cases, slave quarters. The way that the community existed was within neighborhoods, and there was a lot of movement of people around, but mostly just on the weekends to attend different social gatherings, maybe a party that was sponsored by an owner that was often work-related, like a barn raising or a corn shucking, for example. Then there would be a party afterwards, or sometimes a wedding. And certainly people saw one another at church on Sunday morning because most of the churches in the regions of Missouri that had a large number of slaves were integrated churches, and they would see one another there. But they weren't seeing They weren't seeing other enslaved people oftentimes on a daily basis, and I think that made it very challenging for people. Up until, right before the Civil War, where it does start to change because different people start to move into the state, there becomes a large immigrant population, mostly Germans, but some Irish as well. There are northern interests that move into the state. A place like St. Louis has become very diverse. In fact, it has the largest per capita immigrant population of any American city in 1860, which is kind of hard to believe, but it's true. And so it's starting to change, and there starts to become a little bit more of a conflict between the people that are living there. So while some aspects are the same, I think that region and certainly the geography is very important. It's a jumping off place for people going to the west. Most of the trails west originated in Missouri. The situation is really a nightmare. Some of the most horrific guerrilla warfare that occurred anywhere during the Civil War happened in Missouri. There was a lot of conflict going back and forth across the border, and I found that Missouri slaves really took advantage of that situation and ultimately struck a blow for their own freedom, much earlier than would have happened in other parts of the South. As early as the summer of 1861, people were taking advantage of the fact that the Union military had occupied the river counties of Missouri. They were starting to run away. People were moving over into Kansas, where they believed that they would find freedom and people who were willing to help them. And in some cases that was true. They were finding people that would help them either escape out of Kansas and get to the north, or even shelter them in Kansas itself. They started recruiting African American troops in Kansas a little over a year into the war. So there are a lot of things about the situation in Missouri that are very tied to the place and what happens there, and to the history of Missouri during the sectional conflict, for example, and its Civil War history, that make it a really unique place, and a place that really hasn't been studied very much by scholars of the American South, and a place that I think is really important for people to take a look at.